be seated. Good morning, Westminster. We are in the second Sunday of Advent as we are getting closer and closer to this day of Christmas. And in our Advent season, we are talking about the 4 candles that we traditionally light during Advent to get us ready for Christmas. The candles are named Peace, Hope, Love, and Joy. And the image that we're using, that I set up last week in the sermon, the image that we're using is that the Advent is supposed to tell the story of when people were waiting for the promises of God to be fulfilled. And so there is this time of darkness as they were waiting for the coming of God and for the promises of God to be fulfilled. But in the darkness, it wasn't a darkness without hope, because it was a darkness knowing that a sunrise was coming. And in the darkness, while waiting for the sunrise, God had given his people lights along the way. And in our Advent season, we talk about the lights that God has given us in the darkness, waiting for the promises of God to be fulfilled as peace and hope and love and joy, and things that are given to us to help light our way along our path in this life until all is completed and the new creation comes. Now, one of the things I set up last week, and if you missed the sermon, it's on the website, you can check it out, is that we tend to think of love and peace and hope and joy as simply as things we are given, things that we sit back and we either have them or we don't. And biblically, that is not the way the Bible talks about it. Those things are not considered gifts, they're considered fruit. And the difference between gifts and fruit is that gifts are received and fruit is cultivated. Fruit is cultivated. And so for fruit, you have to start with the seed. So the presence of God begins the seed within us, but then we do the work of helping to grow it. And so in order to have the fruit of love, you have to practice loving. We don't get to sit back and say, like, I'm sorry, God did not give me the gift of love. You are out of luck, family. That is just not the way it works. We practice loving, and through our practice of loving in the presence of God, the fruit of love is grown within us. Last week we talked about peace, practicing trusting God so that the fruit of peace is grown within us. This morning we're going to talk about hope. This morning we light the candle of hope, a beacon that guides us throughout the dark days of life. And I want to start by disabusing you of 2 notions that most people think of when they think of hope, primarily because they're not thinking about a biblical hope, they're thinking about a Hallmark hope, which is a slightly different concept. In fact, I discovered many times people think they're thinking of the Bible, they're actually thinking of a Hallmark movie. Hope is, first of all, not primarily an emotion. It's not primarily something you feel or you don't feel. We all, feelings are great. We have very little control over them. If I were to tell you right now, be happy, it doesn't work, right? And some of you are like, yes, it does. If it does, great. You can go get some coffee. The sermon's not for you. Most of us, we don't have control over our emotions like that. There are simply things that we experience as gifts or as not gifts. And hope, and so if you think about hope as an emotion, then it's either something you have or you don't, right? It's either something, oh, I feel hopeful today, or I don't feel hopeful today. It's not the way the Bible talks about it. Hope is not primarily just something we feel, it's something we practice. It's something we do. The second thing I need to disabuse us of is that hope is not the same as optimism. Hope is not the same as optimism. Optimism is the looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, where the glass is always half full and things are always going to be all right. So an optimist, if you're looking at a pool of water out in East Texas somewhere, and the optimist and the pessimist are standing beside this pool of water debating whether or not to go swimming, the optimist says, oh, no, there are no snakes in there. There's nothing in there. It's perfectly clear and wide. This is going to be great. We should go swimming and have a great time. The pessimist, looking at the same pool of water, says, oh, there are alligators. There are not only snakes, there's probably some weird South American bacteria that's going to eat you as soon as you dive into the water. And everyone's going to die as soon as we get into that pool, because it's 2 different ways of looking at the exact same situation and seeing it differently. And people think hope is being the optimist. Here's the problem with that. Optimists aren't always objectively right about the world, right? Because sometimes there are actually snakes in the pool. And so if you are looking as an optimist at looking at this kind of objective reality, saying, no, nothing bad's ever going to happen, then sometimes you are going to be wrong. Because that's not simply the way the world works. Hope is different. I'm going to suggest to you this morning that hope is a practice of looking toward and anticipating God's good future because we trust in who God is. Let me say that again. Hope is the practice of looking toward, expecting, anticipating God's good future because we trust who God is. And that practice of looking toward and anticipating God's good future then allows some of the rays of the coming sunrise, some of the light of the good future to shine back on us where we are right now. It is an active expectation. It is an active looking toward, an active practicing, an active working toward, not just a sitting down waiting for God to make me feel better about life. If we're using our image of the pool, the Christian hope is standing next to that pool saying, one day, God is going to make this good, and in the meantime, there might be things that we can do now to work alongside God to make this pool safe for everyone to enjoy. Do you see the difference between that? See the difference between that and optimism? So here, I want to talk to you a little bit about Romans, because in here, Paul lays out a whole lot of his basic theology in Romans, and he has a whole section on hope, which has been confusing to a lot of people because he uses words that are odd in their translation into English. And he looks primarily, so the problem he is trying to tackle is people who are racked by their own guilt before God. They are aware of their part in the sinfulness of the world. They are aware of their part in the brokenness of the world. And they are aware that they can never live up to God's standards. And so he lays out his basic thesis, which is that it is by faith we are saved, by grace we are saved through faith. And as we talked this summer, what the word faith means is mostly trust. It's about 10% belief, 90% trust. Our trust in God is what allows his saving work to start within us. And so that what he says, starting in chapter 5, is therefore, since we are justified, and that word justified means declared righteous, since we have been declared righteous through faith, through our trusting in God, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Meaning that when we start to trust with God, the trust grows peace. Remember, that's what we talked about last week. The trust grows peace within us. The peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we've obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast, he says we boast in two things. We boast not only in our future sharing of glory, so we boast not only in that everything's going to be good one day, but, and this is what trips people up, we also boast in our current sufferings, which is where he says, we boast, where he's going, we find hope, we find our strength in the future goodness, our future glories, and also in our present sufferings, because suffering produces endurance. And the words there, suffering is also translated tribulation, trial. It doesn't actually mean physical suffering. It means anything that challenges us, anything that presses us, that stresses us. That produces endurance, which is the ability to withstand something. Endurance produces character, and that word character is a very odd Greek word that literally means something that has been proven to withstand. Something that has been proven. So if you think about, you build a bridge and you have to test whether it's going to hold the weight. Once it's been tested, it's been proven true. That's the kind of character he's talking about. Something that has been tested and proven true. Suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces that character within us, the ability to withstand. And character produces hope, which in this context, I think means the ability to believe God when He says the future is going to be good, even if it doesn't look like it right now. And the reason I wanted to bring this passage up for you today is if we're talking about which verb is linked to which fruit, love is easy, right? We love, that produces love. Linguistically, the rest of our words don't work that way. Hope, in this context, what Paul seems to be saying is that it is putting our suffering under the grace of God and seeing it in the context of God, relying on God during that and finding God to be faithful that allows us to trust the character of God in the rest of our lives. Does that make sense? It is the act, it is the ability when we are in times of trial to see God's hand in it, to see God's grace through it, to trust Him enough to allow Him to strengthen us through those trials, and realize that with His strength, even when we are tested, we will not break because He is holding us in His hand. And coming through those trials in relationship with God then gives us the hope that maybe God wasn't crazy when He said He was going to make the whole world new. Because if He could do this for me, then maybe He's going to do what He said and make all of the world new. And the hope that is grown within us is an active looking toward, expecting, working toward God's good future, not just for all of us individuals, although including all of us individuals, but for all of creation. Now, some of you are like, Meredith, it's Christmas time. Seriously, why are we talking about suffering? Why are we talking about tribulation? Why? Look, it's not my fault, it's Paul's. He's the one who said it first. And the problem is, if we are going to talk about what hope means, you do not get hope divorced from any kind of tribulation. Because you don't need hope unless you've ever been hopeless. Right? You don't need hope unless you have ever come to a point in your life where you start to distrust that God knows what He's doing, when you start to think that maybe it's all going to be dark in the future, when you start to think that maybe you are going to break under the weight that has been put on you, you don't need hope until that point. And at that point, the act of trusting God through that grows within us something that doesn't make sense when you look at it from the outside. And that hope within us leads us to live in a kind of way that other people look at us and say, that's just crazy. That's just crazy. And it's not because we believe the world has nothing bad to say. It's not because we believe there are no snakes in the pool. It's because we believe God is who He said He is. God is going to do what He says He's going to do. And if God has been faithful to me, God will be faithful to the world. And the end of our story and the end of all stories is good. And that even if we look out at the world and it seems there is nothing but darkness, we know that that is only the darkness before the coming of the dawn. Because God has a future planned. Now, if we believe that, and I understand that that is a hard thing to believe at sometimes, if we believe that, then the implications that it has on our lives range from the affecting the small little decisions we make to affecting the large decisions we make on a grand scale. If we believe that, then it means anytime we come in our life where the rest of the world would look in and to say, you are hopeless, we say, we are never without hope. We are never without hope. So this is where I have seen many a couple where the rest of the world looks in and says, your marriage was done 20 years ago. And they say, because of the grace of God, because of the faithfulness of God, God can make all things new. And if God can make the world new, God can make this new. It is hope like this that leads people to keep on with ministries they feel they've been called to, even when it looks from the outside like nothing has happened. One of my favorite stories that actually happened in this conference. Next week, I'm going to be guest preaching. While you guys are enjoying Music Sunday, I'm going to be guest preaching at a church in Galveston that about 5 years ago had 4 members over the age of 90. And that was it. It used to be a great big church. It had a whole block down in Galveston. It had this beautiful old Gothic sanctuary. In its day, it was full of people. It did the work of Christ in the city of Galveston. And like many churches, it had gotten to the point where they'd fallen and they'd fallen and they'd fallen and they'd fallen. And finally the day came when they looked out and they realized that there were literally 4 people sitting in the pews on Sunday morning, and they were all in their 80s and 90s. And so the district superintendent was sitting in that sanctuary looking around at this beautiful worship space. And what he said within him is God done here yet? Is God really done here yet? Because the world looks at that and says, of course God's done here. God left that building 20 years ago. But maybe the God who does new things wants to do a new thing here. And so they brought in a crazy young pastor. They took out half the pews. They put in couches. They put up a worship band. They started worshiping. Today, about 4 years later, they have 150 people in that sanctuary. And here's the miraculous part. It is almost entirely people who were not in church. It is almost entirely people who had either written off church or never been in church, and through the work of that church have found a relationship with God, and their hashtag, their motto that they sign everything with is grace wins. Grace wins. That's the kind of story that Christian hope points us toward. It is not a sitting back and letting us feel good about ourselves. It is not a feeling sentimental when we look out at all of the things happening in our lives. It is a decision to look and work for the good future of God, even when there are no signs of that good future around us. Do you hear the difference between that? Do you hear the active difference between that? Hope is not a gift, it's a fruit. And the cultivation of that fruit in your life and in my life then leads the good future of God to sometimes start making appearances in the here and now, right? Because it is when we recognize and work toward and press toward and expect that good future that all of a sudden we start seeing glimpses of it now. And a church that was dead becomes alive, and a marriage that was dead becomes alive, and a life that was hopeless discovers that there is hope in the end. And the truth that Christianity would have us believe, the truth that we proclaim, is, as Paul says later in Romans, neither life nor death, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor power, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ, our Lord. And if you believe that in your soul of souls, and you trust that when the days get hard and the nights get dark, you will never be without a candle, and you will never be without hope. Because the truth is, you are not without hope. And wherever you find yourself in this life, you do not find yourself beyond the grace of God and beyond the goodness of God, because there is no twist and turn your life can take that is not held up in the story of God and cannot be redeemed by the goodness of God. And there is nothing that can happen to you that God cannot make well in the end. And so this morning I invite you, and some of you, you know what, some of you are listening to the sermon and life is good and you are happy and you're like, Meredith, I like Hallmark movies. If that's you, that's great. Keep the sermon in your back pocket for a future day, because there are some of you out there that need to hear this morning. And if that's you, the word of the Lord this morning is this: neither life nor death, nor angels nor demons, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation can separate you from the love of your God in Jesus Christ, and that God has promised the end of your story and all stories is good. Would you join me in prayer?